Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And obviously, this is a rule that has generated a lot of discussion in every state, especially states like ours in Kansas and North Dakota, where over 90% of our land mass is engaged in farming. Unlike Kansas, we have had an unusual wet cycle. I recently had another member touring the border, and we were in a helicopter, and I pointed down to northwestern North Dakota, where it's never been wet like this before. And I said, do you think EPA and the Corps have jurisdiction over that water? And that's the question. Do they have jurisdiction or don't they have jurisdiction? And so I think the most important thing we can do is provide certainty. And I understand what you're all saying about, this or that, but, would point out General Rutledge that EPA or that IRS issues letter opinions, interpretive opinions every day. You got to be careful when you're saying all interpretive rules would be subject to notice and rulemaking, because there's a lot of that's going on, and we're engaged, Senator Langford and I are engaged in a process where we're actually trying to sort out how this process should go forward. But the point that I want to make, I think, is that what is the waters of the United States? Anyone want to give me a 1-minute definition of what the waters of the United States are? It's pretty hard. It's pretty complicated, and we all know it's complicated, from jurisdictions to when we used to have the EPA cow that we drank out of the pothole, and that created interstate commerce jurisdiction. We know it's not navigable. And I think the court told us in Rapanos it's not navigable in the traditional sense. And so that's created a whole lot of uncertainty that we need to resolve. But I think that we need to appreciate that all of us are in this together, and the worst thing that we can do is create I think a sub-industry here of people coming and spinning, and we spend millions and millions of dollars on controversy when we should be sitting down answering that question, because the court didn't do a very good job. And I would suggest, Secretary, that when you talk about 111D, the EPA was pretty certain they didn't have jurisdiction over CO2. But what did the Supreme Court tell them? They had jurisdiction over CO2 and had to at least contemplate regulation. And so regulation through litigation is not our path forward. It's expensive and it creates uncertainty. So we need to figure that piece out. But I would suggest to you, Mr. Baldy, that if you were proposing a rule and it generated enough interest that we have to hold the hearing in this room, and literally unanimous opposition from every farm group in North Dakota and every farm group across the country, wouldn't you rethink that rule? Wouldn't you step back and say, well, obviously, one of two things, they're not understanding what I'm trying to do, or maybe I am overreaching and we need to have another conversation. Wouldn't you do that?
Rules are complicated business, and when you have interest on all sides, you sometimes have strong opposition from one interest or another. That doesn't necessarily cause an agency to go back to the beginning. You started by asking the question, what are waters of the U.S.? I actually, on the plane flight here, was doing the same thing, looking down at the waters as I was coming across the nation. Very difficult to tell from a picture or from a plane what are and what are not waters of the U.S. What we believe the Corps and EPA have done here is clearly identified some waters that are clearly not waters of the U.S.
But I would tell you that no one thinks what they've done here has clarified what in fact is waters of the United States. I mean, does it mean, a connection through subsurface connections? What exactly are we going to have? And we need to remember, we don't have an EPA rule that we're talking about. We have a proposed rule and a promise that we're going to fix it. And I think there's a whole lot of distrust on whether we are, in fact, going to see a rule that clarifies and fixes some of the concerns. And I think that's where we're at right now. And I guess my point is, wouldn't it be better to basically propose a new rule, and it can be the rule that they're working on now, and open it back up for comment so that people can have additional dialogue and additional consultation with states. Here's 3 states saying they want that additional discussion. Wouldn't that be a better path forward?
Well, from Washington State's perspective, we would like them to do additional work on the rule before it is finalized. So we agree that there are some improvements that we can see in the rule. We have seen the federal agencies and other rulemaking actually improve and work with the states. And again, in the last 6 months, 8 months, very different from when they proposed the rule. So we have believed that they have been much more interactive, EPA in particular, over the last few months.
And just if I can have just a little more time, but having the ability to see where their thinking is now and comment on it and have further dialogue before it's finalized, can't you see some value in that?
We anticipate more interaction, and again, that's why we have called for these regional discussions, regional definitions with the federal agencies. They have been responsive in other rulemaking. We believe they will be here as well.
I guess my point is that we have had a lot of controversy around this rule. It seems to me that we ought to have more conversation and more certainty. And simply saying, trust us, probably isn't going to sit very well with a lot of the witnesses and a lot of the discussion on this panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.